Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. Tom Giffard was elected in 2021 as the Welsh Conservative Member of the Senedd for South Wales West. Upon his election, he became the Shadow Minister for Culture, Tourism and Sport. Since then, he has used his scrutiny skills to hold the Welsh Government to account on issues such as their proposed visitor levy and the Welsh Rugby Union on, well, let's face it, a lot of what's going wrong with the WRU. Tom, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, how are you doing? You all right?
Very well. Tom, let's start with the WRU. Obviously, the nation was appalled by what they heard in the recent BBC documentary. What is your assessment of what's been happening there?
Well, it's been going for a couple of weeks now since we saw the documentary, and I've watched the documentary back a couple of times really since it aired, and it's thoroughly depressing, to be honest, to know that a major organisation in Wales runs sort of in that way, and those sort of attitudes exist in the way that they do. Obviously, as you know, we've had WRU into the Senedd. We've also had the Deputy Minister for Sport, Dawn Bowden, to our committee, and Sport Wales as well more recently. And the one thing that struck me, I guess, was the number of people that sort of said, well, you know, I knew this sort of thing was going on, but actually it wasn't really my place to do anything about it, or I didn't know anything formally. So that's probably the bit I find the most depressing about it all, really, is the fact that, you know, this was known. It would have been a shock to a lot of people, but it perhaps wouldn't have been a surprise that these attitudes pervaded in the Welsh Rugby Union, but quite why nobody thought to act or challenge them up until the airing of the documentary is really surprising.
You talk about that Senedd session. Obviously, you spoke to Ieuan Evans and Nigel Walker. I think a lot of coverage was on the fact that bits of Ieuan Evans' autobiography were spoken back at him during that session about the concerns he had about the culture in the WRU when he was still playing. So it does seem odd that there's not been any sort of efforts to change it in that time, and even when Ieuan Evans himself was on the board.
Yeah, and on his autobiography, I'm going to give credit to a member of the public who got in touch with us as a committee to flag that, and I got my hands on a copy of Ieuan Evans' autobiography, and it's actually quite startling. So I read out some quotes from him in terms of the way he thought the clubs sort of rule too much of the way the Welsh Rugby Union runs, and were kind of a block on change. And obviously, you know, look, you don't want to make yourself hostage to fortune when you write these things. And probably he would never have thought that when he wrote that autobiography that he'd be, you know, sitting in a Senedd committee having to defend it nearly 30 years later. But nevertheless, the fact that he had said those things when he was a player, recognized that they were issues, and obviously then had to go and canvass those same clubs to go and get support for, you know, to be put in the position that he was really quite significant. So, you know, there's an assessment that there was a need for change, and I think Ieuan probably recognizes there is a need for change, but, you know, maybe it's one of those ones that up until it takes something like what we saw with the WRU to take it out of the too difficult pile, almost. So I'm pleased to see, you know, the changes that they've made. I'm pleased to see the independent task force. It shows they're taking it seriously. And I did think when they came to our committee that they were committed to taking it seriously. They were clearly embarrassed and quite appalled by what had happened, and that they were hoping to deliver change. But obviously, it goes back to the way the Welsh Rugby Union is structured. The power is with the clubs, and they've got to now sell this to the ordinary grassroots clubs across Wales. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next couple of weeks and months.
I think that was James Stafford who gave you that information, who was actually on the one of our panelists the last time we did a big pod on rugby. So weird, small world, Wales is a village. It was very interesting. It seems to me that very soon after these sessions, much media furor then went to the decision to announce that Delilah would not be sung by choirs at the stadium, even though this had sort of happened quite a long time before that announcement. What do you think was the WRU's motivation to make this announcement? Do you think it was some sort of cynical attempt to move the conversation away from the problems, or do you think it was some type of olive branch? What do you think?
In my view, it's a bit of a distraction, right? Is that I think the WRU, you look back at the timeline, right? From the top of my head, the WRU, that documentary had come out on the Monday, and it wasn't until the Sunday until Steve Phillips had resigned. And let's be blunt, not a lot had happened with the WRU in that time. The second week, if you like, things did start to pick up with the appointment of Nigel Walker in his place and so on. But sometimes I think organizations can want to look as though they're doing a lot and sort of overcompensate in other areas in order to sort of create that impression. And I think that's where the Delilah thing come from. As you say, you know, it had been banned from the playlist, as best I understand it, in 2015. but it stopped choirs playing it. Oh, it might be the other way around. I can't remember, which was the announcement that was made. But it's clearly well-intentioned, right? The heart is in the right place kind of thing. And I don't have a problem with the WRU necessarily saying that. It's just the timing of it. I'm surprised that given everything that was going on in the WRU in that week, given all of the external and internal pressures on WRU, that somebody was worrying about lyrics from a song from 50 odd years ago. Seems a very odd decision. And ultimately, you're never going to be able to stop fans singing it in the stands and so on. And as has been proved in the games that followed, that did continue to happen. So, whether you ended up drawing more attention to it in the long run, I don't know. But it does seem to be the case, at least in the short term, that that's exactly what happened.
One of the biggest long-standing concerns about the game in Wales has been the finances, however. Obviously, we've seen information this week that it says that maybe the Ospreys might be merging with an English club in Ealing and playing in the URC. Why is this £100 million a year business struggling so much to finance the game in Wales, Tom?
It's interesting. I guess I wish I knew the answer to that. But when we had the WRU in for a session, and in particular when we had the Welsh Government in, we talked about the money that WRU receives from the Welsh Government via Sport Wales. And there's about, I think it's 800,000 in the last financial year. And what WRU kept saying and Welsh Government kept saying was, well, it only makes up a small proportion of what the WRU earns. So if we put some strings on this, and if we told the WRU that, in order to receive this money, they needed a change and so on, it wouldn't have made much of a difference. But actually, on the other hand, now we're dealing with a problem where the WRU does seem to be in financial straits. Being honest about it, if you look back to where rugby was 20 years ago before the regions and where it is today, I can't tell you with any confidence, really. It's made the game particularly stronger. And what's equally as concerning is I think the pathways for elite talent to get through to that men's rugby team for the national team sort of is narrower perhaps than it would have been 20 years ago. So, it's obviously depressing to see the players threatened to go on strike before that game against England. That was real. It's a game, but though it's again, is it the Welsh Rugby Union? Just because they'll have known that these issues were pervading, they'll have known these issues would have been in the squad. But is it again a case of the Welsh Rugby Union only acting when things are getting very public and are very apparent and very out there? And just like the BBC documentary, this seems to be the same all over again. I haven't got the magic bullet as to how you finance this. And I think one of the things this whole past couple of weeks has thrown up is that there should be a distance between politics and politicians and the way sport is run. So I don't think it would be appropriate for me or indeed the Welsh Government to come up with the ideas for these things. But, it is incredibly concerning. And I think it does warrant sort of more investigation, if you like, in terms of what WRU is playing at here.
I mean, rugby is just one of these things that seems so sort of fundamental, especially to South Walians, to our sort of cultural link to our country. Obviously, what part of your brief is tourism. People come from all over the world to experience rugby in Wales, to experience the Welsh tourism sector. But you've been very vocal in your opposition to the Welsh Government's visitor levy, as you would probably call it, a tourism tax. Would you be able to explain your opposition to that, Tom?
That was a beautiful segue from rugby into tourism, by the way. So the fundamental point with the tourism tax, I think, is this, right? Is that we've just come out of a pandemic, right? Tourism was shut down in this country for the best part of nearly 3 years with various restrictions, either full lockdown or restricting where people could travel and so on. And it made, despite all the support that was available from UK government and Welsh government, it made those businesses very sort of live hand to mouth for a period of time. We know it's a huge part of our economy in Wales. 1 in 7 jobs, about 200,000 people rely on the tourism sector thriving in Wales. And so, again, we don't know what form this tax will take, right? But what we do know is, I accept, right? I represent South Wales West, which includes tourist areas like Porthcawl and like Mumbles. I fully accept that if you go to those places sometimes on a sunny Saturday afternoon, the place is absolutely packed. And it does cause a real problem for local people. I never doubt that. And I fully accept that is an issue. But what we think this tax will do, from what the Welsh Government have said so far, it will be a tax on overnight stays rather than on people that visit a tourism location just for a day. And I think if you look at the spend, if you look at the contribution that people that spend a day in a tourism area make to a local economy versus people who stay overnight, I think it's people who stay overnight spend 14 times more in that local economy than people who come for a day. And so if you're discouraging people from staying overnight, they're the very people that you actually want to come. It doesn't do anything to stop the day travelers. It doesn't do anything to stop the people coming in their carts down to Mumbles for an afternoon. But what it does do is stop the people that will keep that pub viable or keep that local business going in a local area. So, we worked out that based on international examples, it probably add an extra £70 a week onto a stay for a family of four, given the fragility of the industry, given that, a lot of travelers are cost conscious, that might make the difference between whether they come to Porthcawl or whether they spend a weekend in Weston-super-Mare. And those are our competitors ultimately. And they're the people that, we need to be competing against and saying, actually, you're better off spending a week or a weekend in Porthcawl.
I mean, that's the thing that's always leveled at this criticism, isn't it, Tom, that this is a tax or a levy that's used basically all across the world. But obviously, not to take anything away from Porthcawl or Mumbles, but if you're going to Sardinia or Sicily, you're already spending probably a bit more money. So that kind of price difference doesn't matter as much. Whereas if you're price conscious and you're choosing between South Wales and Cornwall, for example, then maybe that small financial hit will make a massive difference as to where you go.
Yeah, completely. And we know that actually travelers that tend to stay within the UK, if you just think of the UK domestic market, the travelers that tend to stay in the UK where it might be their only holiday will make that decision based on cost choices. So if you're adding £70 to an overall bill for a family of four to go and stay in a caravan park in Porthcawl, as I say, one in Devon somewhere, the difference is quite stark. And actually, I don't know why we would want to push ourselves out of a market to compete. Now, the kind of accusation from the other hand, if you like, that's leveled at, which I again accept as a fair critique, is, well, shouldn't people who come to visit an area make a contribution to local economy? But there's 2 points I'd make in response to that. First of all is what we just said, right, is that the people who are actually having the biggest impact are the people that stay just for a day and go. This tourism tax doesn't do anything to help towards that. Secondly, you got to look at this in a kind of wider picture. So what we've seen so far from the Welsh government is a kind of aspiration that it'll go towards helping a tourism offer in an area. But in reality, when I've asked the press ministers about it, what we do know about it, and again, it's still not a final phase yet, so we don't completely know how this will come out, but what we do know is that this will be a tax that will be collected by local councils, and it doesn't seem like there'll be any way for councils to kind of ring fence that funding to go on and support a local tourism offer. So, you know how council budgets work. Well, I do from 5 years I spent before being a Senedd member in councils. Is that a pot of money, which is probably quite small on the scale of the amount of money that goes for a council, if it's not specifically ring fenced, can kind of get lost in kind of day-to-day spend. So you probably would end up in a position where you're taxing people that come, reducing the pool of people that do come to your area in turn, but also then you don't necessarily see the benefit of that spend being spent on improving a tourism offer or adding infrastructure and so on to that area either. I think Adam Price said he hoped that it would be spent on expanding free school meals, for example. So, again, it just needs a little bit of foresight from Welsh government to say, okay, well, if we are going to press ahead with this, we really need to make sure it stays within a tourism economy and to improve a tourism offer.
How would you go then about improving that tourism offer, Tom? How would you go about financing it so that the tourism feels sustainable, but also we are attracting more people to Wales? Well,
that's the $1 million question, right? And that's ultimately what one of the things that I do as the Shadow Minister for Tourism really is to kind of push the Welsh government to take tourism probably a little bit more seriously than it does. Now, the place I'd start is Visit Wales. So Visit Wales sits entirely within the Welsh government. Visit Britain, for example, or Visit England as well, are organisations that are independently led and kind of sit outside of formal government. And what that means is that there's one thing one tourism operator told me is that he felt as though he hadn't heard from Visit Wales since it had been taken into Welsh government, and he felt that it was more about servicing government and servicing ministers than it was about promoting the tourism industry. And what we see with those ones that sit outside of government is that they are better at bringing together the best minds, if you like, bringing together independent voices that kind of push for things. So, for example, going back to the tourism levy, Visit Britain has come out and said that they don't support a tourism levy. You never hear Visit Wales saying that, because obviously they exist within Welsh government, so they'd obviously wouldn't be able to make that point. But it's about, for me, figuring out what Wales is and how we market ourselves. And actually, some things have been really, really welcome, I think, in terms of the marketing that Visit Wales has done. But you think of your international traveller, let's say from America, they'd be fascinated by the number of castles that we have in this place, and the kind of mythology of dragons and all the rest of it, as an example. And do we make enough play on those things internationally? I'm not necessarily sure that we do. So if you think about it as like a deck of cards in someone's hand, the Welsh government's got a great hand here in terms of actually what Wales has got in terms of its just natural resources, in terms of a tourism offer. It really needs to make the most of them, and ultimately that's what we'd want to see is an independent Visit Wales is really pushing the Welsh government to make the most of the tools that it has at its disposal.
While we're on tourism still, I think one of the more important decisions in the tourism space that the Welsh government have made, but one that doesn't get as much attention, is the changes to the occupancy threshold on self-catering properties, which people from the tourism industry say could actually be even more damaging than the tourism tax.
Yeah. So to give it its proper context, what happens here is if you're staying in a rural area, quite often you won't rent out a big chain hotel, a big Premier Inn in mid Wales, for example. What you'll end up probably doing if you come to stay is rent out a self-catering holiday let property. And at the moment, people who rent those out pay business rates, if you like, if they let it out for more than 70 days per year. So if you think about the seasonality of the way people let things out, obviously, that's very popular in the summer, less popular in the winter, and so kind of levels out. What the industry said is, there's an inherent degree of unfairness there, I think, would be the critique, right? That it only requires 10 weeks a year for that to be let out in order for someone to pay business rate and not council tax as though it's a home. So the sector said, well, look, we're very open to looking at this and reviewing this and changing the way that this works. And they pushed for 105 days. Well, what the Welsh government has come up with is 182 qualifying days a year for it to be let out. So essentially 6 months out of the 12 in a year that a holiday let property would need to be let out to qualify to pay business rates. If it didn't do that, it would pay council tax. And obviously, going on to a wider issue, they might end up paying council tax as though it's a second home, which could be 3 times the level of council tax. So the bill that would cost would be obscene compared to what it is currently. And so that would have a real impact in terms of the viability of a lot of these places. And actually, being realistic, the vast majority of these self-catering holiday lets are not letting out anywhere near 6 months in the year. And so, the idea that they're going to be able to meet the 182 to avoid having to pay that triple council tax figure is quite bad. Welsh government did a consultation on it, and only 1% of the respondents thought it was a good idea. But they're backing, they're sort of pushing ahead with this thing. And what it means is, going back to that earlier point, right, is that if you've got a holiday let, or if you've got a tourism business in rural Powys or rural Gwynedd, the holiday let is the only thing you've got. If they withdraw from that market, where do you stay if you want a weekend away in a rural area in Wales? If they're being taxed in this way, if they're being taxed as though it's a second home. I think 73% of holiday let owners say they might end up quitting over the changes. So it really gives you an indication of the scale of the problem here. And it's something I hope the Welsh government will look to address in the future before it's too late.
What do you make of the accusations, though, Tom, that these currently self-catering properties could be family homes otherwise if they weren't, being used for this purpose?
Well, look, so it's different, right? You've got a different picture in terms of the way holiday lets are being used in different areas. So if I take an example of farmers, right, they were told a number of years ago by the Welsh Government. They needed to diversify their businesses, to look at other ways of raising money. Well, one of the things that I know a couple of farms have done, for example, is set up holiday let self-catering properties on their farmland. And they've been very popular, and they've revitalized not only that farm, but actually the community that farm is based in. For them then to turn around and say, well, actually, no, you now need to sell these off as family homes. Well, they're not necessarily designed for that. Quite often in the planning, that's not allowed to happen. They're built to be holiday lets. And so, it becomes really difficult then for those sorts of houses to do that. I'm really sorry about that. I got an automatic cat feeder. So there's the cat.
Amazing.
Cat's time to eat was right then.
Yeah, I find this subject really interesting, because so many of these policies that people have been pushing the Welsh Government to do for years, and they've not seemed too keen. But obviously now with the cooperation agreement with Plaid Cymru, they're pushing forward with these plans. Do you think that Welsh Labour would have backed these plans originally, or do you think they're just doing it to win over Plaid Cymru support?
Well, it's clear that there are problems with second homes, right? And I think Plaid Cymru, particularly, people like Mabon at Gwynfor and Gwynedd, for example, have really kind of set their stall out based around the idea that they're going to tackle problems to do with second homes in the communities that they represent. And I totally understand that. I don't necessarily know if it would have been a huge priority for the Labour Party. I suppose that's for them to answer. But the problem I kind of foresee with this is that the tourism economy is kind of being dragged along with it in a way that might be an unforeseen or an unintended consequence of some of these changes. So we talked about the changes to self-catering holiday let properties earlier. Well, one of the issues with that is there's no actual definition of what a second home is. There's no actual definition of what a self-catering holiday let property is. And so when you try to legislate to kind of tax one of them or to enhance another, it actually becomes a really, really grey area as well. So I think one of the disappointments from people in the tourism sector that I've talked to is, well, they're happy to work with Welsh Government to just kind of come up with ideas here. But as I say, they felt ignored in the consultation responses. So as I said before, 1% of people thought that these changes were a really good idea. And yet the Welsh Government pushed ahead with it anyway. So, it's no surprise there's so many people in the holiday let industry thinking that they might have to give up as a result. So, yeah, unfortunately, we don't want a thriving tourism sector in Wales to be kind of the victim of, this Labour implied cooperation agreement that is seeking to actually tackle a totally different problem.
Well, I was going to say that it seems to me one of the easiest ways to deal with this would just to be building more homes. But yeah, that's historically been a problem in Wales anyway for a long time.
Yeah, and it's always been the case. And it's actually a frustration to me. And one of the things I'd say about the Senedd generally, but my group in particular, is we've had a load of people elected at the same time who are roughly the same age, right? I'm 31, and I think of Gareth Davis and Sam Kurtz and James Evans and others. We were all elected roughly at the same time, and actually that housing need is a big one for all of us. Like, I didn't own a home until literally until a few months ago, and a number of us are also in the same boat. So a lot of us are really aware that that's a real problem, which I think possibly in a generation prior wouldn't have even been a consideration for a lot of people. So we really need to get on and build more houses, frankly. And you'd actually see a lot of these other issues, as you say, that would be solved with it. But unfortunately, that's not been the case so far.
Let's talk about the cooperation agreement. What's your assessment on the cooperation agreement and its impact on politics in Wales?
Well, it's been interesting, more for Plaid Cymru than for anybody else, because what's frustrated me, right? We had a Senedd election result where Labour did get 30 seats, but ultimately, didn't quite get that one extra they needed for a majority. So they needed to reach out to Plaid Cymru to get that support. Now, I've got no problem with a formal coalition if that's what opposition parties want to do with the governing party. What I find odd about this cooperation agreement, and I heard Heaven David recently criticising it on this premise as well, is that they've kind of got one foot in government and one foot in opposition. So, they were kind of taking issue, if you like, with a budget that they would end up having to support anyway as a result of the cooperation agreement. So it's a really odd political setup at the moment. So I think there were accusations last year levelled at Adam Price, perhaps he's going too softly on Mark Drakeford in First Minister's questions because he had a vested interest in the delivery of government because he was committed to that programme as well. So it's thrown up a whole load of issues, I think, in terms of the way we conduct politics in the Senedd. What is a governing party and what is an opposition, because actually there's probably people on the Plaid benches now who are more powerful than the people on the back benches on the Labour side. But, one of them have all the powers and the privileges, of opposition, and the other one perhaps doesn't. So that's thrown up its own set of issues. And the other thing I'd say as well about the cooperation agreement is that it does seem to be kind of eroding away slightly. There was I could feel the unity perhaps a bit more a year ago between Plaid Cymru and Labour than I do now. And it's very interesting to see Plaid go at Labour on the state of the NHS in Wales in particular. And I think Eluned Morgan said recently, I think it was about what is one of the NHS professions pay, for example, and potential strike action, saying, well, I'm happy to reopen the cooperation agreement, happy to come back and, revisit this. So it strikes me as a little bit of a missed opportunity as well from Plaid. So they've delivered things like the free school meals. We've talked before about the changes to second homes rules. But actually, what are the big issues that impact the people of Wales? Well, it's health, education and economy. And really, I'm seeing very little in terms of what that cooperation agreement is delivering for the people of Wales.
While we're on the economy and, of course, the climate as well, one of the big bits of news recently in Wales has been the roads review. What was your immediate response to that announcement?
Well, we sort of knew it was coming, right? And the big tell, I guess, would have been a little while ago when we saw the cancelling the M4 relief road, which would have been a blow to many after so much money being spent on the development of it in the first place. And this is just taking it one step further. I guess the point you could look at and the point you could make is, well, I think the argument Lee Waters is making, well, we keep building more roads and more cars will fill the spaces on the roads, which I can kind of, I can understand where he's coming from with that. But there's a failure of recognition, I think, from Welsh government in terms of, well, what does the future look like? What do roads look like in 20 years from now, for example? Well, we know that they're going to be probably electric cars. We'll stop selling petrol cars in 2030 in the UK. And actually, there's very little recognition that, well, we're going to move forward here and have a road network that has not been updated, has not been kept up to date. We're going to have cars that are green, but then the road network in Wales is going to be so far out of date that it's not going to be able to meet not only the current demand, but future demand as well. So if it was tailed in with either, a huge increase in the way public transport here works in Wales, buses, trains and the like, or indeed a increase in the availability of electric charging points, which is in Wales behind the rest of the UK, for example, as it is currently, that would have been one thing. But actually in isolation, I think Ken Skates was quite scathing about it, for example, saying it was a diktat made by politicians in Cardiff because it sounds like a really lovely idea. We're going to stop building roads, but actually what's the practical impact of pursuing that policy? And is very little thought, I think, given to what the future looks like in terms of transport infrastructure in Wales.
Yeah, I mean, Lee Waters himself admitted it was terrible timing, but this announcement came the same week as we started to learn really what was going to happen to the Welsh bus industry. Obviously, only having funding probably for the next 3 months, and then you've also seen decisions like Cardiff East Parkway being called in by the Welsh government. How do you go about creating modal shift if there's nowhere else for drivers to go?
It's difficult. Nothing's ever going to be convenience of the car, right? And the fundamental thing that probably is never going to change. So you've got two options: is to either create a public transport network that complements that in a way that, for example, if I travelled from my local train station here in Bridgend to Cardiff Bay for the Senedd, it means I've got to change currently at Queen Street and then back to Cardiff Bay and all the rest of it. That probably takes twice as long than if I just driven the route, unless it's a particularly busy traffic day. So if we can make it sensible for people to choose to take public transport instead of actually taking away that infrastructure in the first place, that would be one way to go about it. But I think on the wider point, it's just, we're not going to achieve modal shift in Wales in a way that perhaps you would see in somewhere like London because of the geography, frankly. And we've just got to accept that the geography in Wales, if you think about the way in which our geography has worked, particularly in South Wales, we're all built around that M4 corridor and the valleys that run off it. That makes it incredibly difficult to build a reliable train network over and above one that travels east to west from Swansea to Newport. So you can't think in terms of, well, we're just going to stop people from using cars, but it's about how can we get them to use cars less? How can we make electric cars more convenient? How can we incentivize people to take them up? Or, even wider issues with the climate. How can we incentivize people to install solar panels on their home? And their grant schemes we could look at, and so on. None of these things are in isolation, and none of these things are ever as simple as we're just going to ban people from taking a car from one end of Wales to the other. Because, as I say, nothing's ever going to beat that convenience.
The biggest bit of transport news we've had in Wales for years, obviously, was the HS2 decision not to give Wales the Barnet consequentials from HS2. Obviously, the Welsh Conservatives kind of shocked quite a few people by sort of echoing those calls and saying that Wales should get its share. But what do you make of that discussion that's sort of gone on between Welsh and UK governments?
One of the reasons we called for that, you say it was a shock, and I can see why people would kind of think that, but from our perspective, we will always, as a group in the Senedd, come out and call things the way we see them. And ultimately, we looked at it, and there are certainly benefits to Wales as a result of HS2. You're thinking of particularly to North Wales in terms of the links to North Wales. And actually, a friend of mine goes from North Wales to London quite regularly, and it's quite a difficult journey at the moment, and involves a few changes. So, there are definitely benefits, but clearly it's not £5 billion worth of benefit. And so that's why we've called for those consequentials to come to Wales. Now, what we'd want to see is to see that being used in a sensible way that improves public transport offerings for people that live here in Wales, on the day-to-day basis. So what we said before, right? It's perhaps those shorter journeys back and forth to the shops or whatever will continue to be done by car, or from one place that is less populated to another, or within rural areas are still probably going to exist via car. But how can we make those larger scale, those longer journeys more convenient, perhaps even cheaper as well? Because that's something that inhibits transport and travel here in Wales as well. So that's why we've called for that money. We want to improve that infrastructure. I thought I was disappointed when, probably not going to make myself popular by saying this, but electrification was cancelled to Swansea, because I thought that was actually a really important route that connects Swansea to London Paddington, but also, the massive sort of economic impact that has with it as well. So, these are the sorts of things that we want to see happen in Wales. But, we're not doing it to make friends in UK government. We're doing it because ultimately that's what we see is the right thing to do. And, we want to see the benefit of HS2 being spread across the United Kingdom and not just in the areas that it directly impacts.
Whilst we're on the topic of the United Kingdom, let's talk a bit about the Union. Obviously, we've seen recently the big news from Scotland that Nicola Sturgeon is standing down as Scottish FM. What impact do you think this will have on their independence debate and the sort of independence debate across the UK?
Well, it's interesting. I don't think the independence debate in Scotland or indeed across the UK is based around one person, but it's clear that Nicola Sturgeon was someone, who was incredibly popular and kind of took that mantra on herself. And I don't think any of her successors will probably be as high profile, and probably will in their initial months and years in the job be, working to develop a profile. In Wales, it's a very different scenario, I think, because we talk a lot more now about independence, I think, than we ever did in the last couple of years in Wales. But if you look at polling, I don't think polling's really changed that much in terms of the public support in Wales for independence. So, the point I always make is, well, there's about equal number of people in Wales that want independence as want to abolish the Senedd. And yet we seem to give a lot of airtime to one side of that debate and not the other. No, I don't sit on either side of that sort of linear debate, if you like. I want to see a Senedd functioning. I want to see it improving the lives of people of Wales, and it can be a good thing. But, I can understand why people might want to get rid of it if there's only ever one party that's run it and runs it in a particular way. So I kind of think that the debate around this can often become quite polar in terms of, well, you either want an independent Wales or you want to scrap the Senedd altogether. And actually where the public are, where most parties are, is somewhere in the middle of that. We want to see a strong Senedd. We want to see a Senedd that delivers things, which is why I was a little bit disappointed to see the Constitutional Commission report by the Welsh Government, or commissioned by the Welsh Government. One of the things that came back from that report, I remember raising in the Senedd, was that 55% of the respondents to that report said that they supported independence. Well, that compares to about 14% according to the last poll, in Wales as a whole. And what that means is that you're taking a kind of skewed set of people that aren't representative of the people of Wales as a whole, and making recommendations from that, or drawing inferences from that, that'll, as though it is representative, they're saying, well, the people of Wales want this and so on. Well, we know that the sample does not come from there. So it's important, I think, that, there is clearly a bubble of people that want independence in Wales. They're very vocal. A lot of them, you'll see them in the replies on my Twitter feed. But ultimately, they don't represent Wales as a whole. It's actually a lot more difficult to go out there and speak to the people that are just quite happy with the status quo. They exist, they're out there, and it's a responsibility, I think, on people, particularly that Constitutional Commission, to engage with those people.
You're about to take part in a Yes Cymru debate, aren't you, in the next couple of months? And I bet you never thought that would happen, but could you tell us how that came about?
Well, it's all my fans on Twitter. No, I think, in all honesty, there's a Welsh Cymru, Yes Cymru, debate happening in Bridgend in April. I think it's April the 20th from the top of my head. And what that basically is about the future of the union, and there's Luke Fletcher and the chair of Yes Cymru on one side, and Hefin David and I from Labour on the other. And essentially just debate the future of the Wales in a united kingdom. Well, that came about purely because I represent that local area. I feel it's really important to be represented. And I kind of think that as unionists, sometimes we can be a little bit guilty of kind of complacency in terms of where we are. I'm glad that people of Wales don't support independence, but I think it's probably fair to say that we're quite complacent sometimes about that fact. So it's important for me and people like me to get out there and keep making that argument over and over again. We saw this in terms of, to give another example, like the unprecedented number of people, I think, that supported Jeremy Corbyn because they don't remember what socialism was like, because there was no Soviet Union and they don't remember the 1970s. People of my generation will have no memory of those things. So it's important that we need to go out and continue to make that case over and over again. And we can't be complacent about it. So that's why I'm going, and I'm sort of looking forward to it in a weird way.
So obviously you've just been made the Welsh Conservative Senedd representative for the Centre for the Union. Often one of the criticisms leveled against the quote unquote union, the unionist side in this debate is that it doesn't tend to be a positive argument for the union, rather a negative argument against independence. How are you sort of going to embrace this role and sort of try and take on the sort of positive arguments rather than just being negative?
Yeah, I think that's really fair in terms of the way, if you look at the way the Scottish referendum was run from the kind of stronger inside, I think that result ended up being a lot closer than probably it should have been for that exact reason. You kind of saw this the Brexit referendum as well from the Remain side. It's that Project Fear kind of thing. You've got to win hearts as well as minds, ultimately, haven't you? So if you look at what the UK can deliver, what the power of the UK can do, you look at the furlough scheme, you look at when COVID had actually having that UK safety net was really, really important. And actually some smaller nations really struggled to cope with the financial hit and the shock of dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. And there's loads more examples like that. But as I said before, I don't think we're good enough sometimes of going out and making them. And actually, I think quite a lot of the arguments I see, and I'm looking forward to this Yes Cymru debate to see if the same ones are made, that are based around the idea of, well, I don't like that the government is doing this, or I don't like that the government is doing that. Well, the solution to that is not to tear the country apart, but is actually just to elect a different government. Now, I accept fully that, I don't want to see a Labour government. I'd like to see continued Conservative government after the next election. But ultimately, I hear all the time from Plaid Cymru in the Senedd, talking about the cruel Tories in Westminster and the only way out of it is independence. Well, that's not the only way out of it. There is another way out of it, and it's to elect a different government in Westminster as well. So I think it would be interesting, to see how the independence argument gets reframed if Labour does go ahead and win that next general election. I'd be very interested to see what they then do for that, because a lot of the arguments have been stacked up on that idea up to now.
I completely agree with you, Tom, and I think it's a vital question for that side of the debate, because so much of it seems to sort of end up being quite an anti-Tory argument rather than an anti-UK argument so much of the time, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So it'd just be interesting to see how it develops more than anything, because there are going to be a new set of arguments. I think one of the other things that Scottish the Scottish referendum debate kind of threw up was, well, there wasn't necessarily a plan for what happens the following day, right? So it's all well and good saying how terrible everything is in the United Kingdom, but actually sell us on what exactly an independent Wales is going to look like. I don't think from the, it's not my job to do the nationalist work for them, but I don't think that sort of vision has been thrashed out well enough either.
No, I mean, we have these debates all the time, but people have moaned for years about Brexit being complicated, but that's probably nothing compared to what it would be like to have an independent Wales. We were talking about the UK government, Conservative, and the idea of Conservative government. We've just had the recent ITV Barn poll, and it's not probably the best poll for the Welsh Conservatives. I'm sure you've had polls you've seen in the past you prefer, but how do the Welsh Conservatives move on from this point instead of try and break through and form a government, or at least maybe consider being the largest party in Wales? Is that something you think you can do?
Oh, it's definitely something I think we can do. And, look, it's obviously really difficult UK-wide context for us at the moment. We're 13 years now into being in government. We're in the middle of a term as well. Traditionally, that's not the strongest point for any party politically, particularly of the instability of the last year. In Wales specifically, I think the way that the Senedd system works, look, I was really pleased. We had our best ever result in 2021, and that was primarily down to Andrew Otti-Davies and the amount of campaigning he did across the country. But I think we need to think about, as a party, how we can appeal in a Welsh context to people across Wales. So, if I give you an example, is that I grew up in rural Welsh-speaking Carmarthenshire. And actually, if you speak to a lot of those people, they are inherently conservatives. The things that they think and the things that they believe are conservatives. Now, the reason that they vote Plaid Cymru instead is because we're just not seen as Welsh enough. And that inherently becomes a problem then for us in terms of our branding and our positioning. I always think if those people knew the sort of things that Plaid Cymru stood for and were campaigning on, which is quite often pitching themselves onto the left of the Labour Party, they'd be appalled. But the kind of lack of attention that's drawn to that from media, but also the lack of presence from us, if you like, in those areas is really important too. And it means we kind of miss out on communicating that message. So unless we can get our act together and get a bit of a stronger Welsh brand, particularly in a Senedd context, I think we'll always struggle. I think we'll always be in opposition, frankly. So we've got to sort out a couple of things in terms of our branding. And the first one, I've thought this for a long time, is that it is ridiculous that we seem to have three leaders in the Welsh Conservative Party all at once. The system Labour has, which seems to have a balance between the MP's interests and the MS's interests, seems to be a model that I would personally prefer. But it does make it more difficult, when you've got three different leaders with competing priorities, to develop a specifically Welsh message. And that doesn't mean that we're any less British in doing that, but clearly, particularly around the Welsh language, but in a whole host of different ways as well, we need to be putting on that red jersey a bit more.
I mean, again, thinking about where the Welsh Conservatives tend to be elected in Wales, I know your group has not been in favour of Senedd reform, but that new system, it may see more Conservatives elected around Wales in places that have never seen Conservatives before. Surely, if that's what you're trying to do, trying to get to those people who may not otherwise know what your policies are or where you stand on certain things, that they may be Conservatives themselves, surely that Senedd reform could actually be a good thing for you.
Potentially. Look, in my region, in South Wales West, we've only ever won constituency seats for Parliament 4 times ever in history, right? And 2 of them were Gower in 2015 and Bridgend in 2019. I was lucky enough to be campaign manager on both of those. And in both instances, what won that election? Obviously, there are national factors that go on that election. But actually, what won those elections was having strong local candidates that were really rooted and based in the local communities and knew the issues that were going on, not only on the national level, but the issues that matter to people across Wales. So what I hope we'd see with this new system is people who are exactly that, rooted in their community, showing the difference that electing Conservatives can make. So I don't think what won't help, I think, is if we've kind of got a set view on, well, these are the people we want to get elected and we're going to throw them anywhere across Wales, because that undermines our credibility really as a party. So, what I hope to see is a system where we're really doing the work now, if you like, identifying strong local candidates that'll have that presence in that community. Because, as you say, this new system could, if we're lucky, give us at least one MS in every part of Wales. And that could be a game changer for us if we pitch it and do it properly. So that's really something I want to see develop over the coming years.
So as we start to think about this, this glorious next Welsh Conservative government, what would that government look like, and what would it do differently? What in your heart is the first thing that government would do in Wales?
Well, I think the biggest difference I'd like to say between a Welsh Conservative government and the current Welsh Labour government is the government that will put the economy first in Wales in particular. So, so often we hear from Welsh Labour about, we haven't had enough money from the UK government for this, that, and the other. And that seems to be the retort when anything goes wrong in Wales. It's blaming the UK government and for the lack of money that's coming. Very little thought, I think, ever given to how you end up growing that pie, how you grow the share of the wealth being generated here in Wales in the first place. And that's what we want to see. We talked about the roads project earlier. There are obviously climate needs for that, and I understand that, but very little attention, I think, given to the economic problems that would cause as well. So, we'd look to put our economy first, invest in projects that are going to have a real boost in the economy, and keep taxes as low as we possibly could. Because ultimately, as I said before, what do people in Wales care about? They care about the NHS, they care about the education, they care about cost of living and climate change. Well, we can't deliver any of those things unless we've got a thriving economy. The easiest thing I always think governments across the world can do is spend money. That's the easiest thing in the world, is how you generate money through tax receipts, through a growing economy in the first place, that does that. So instead of having a government that is built around a redistribution of wealth and spending money, it would be one that generates it in the first instance.
Tom Giffard, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.